I found out my dad sold my late mom's piano to pay for his new wife's Botox, so I bought it back and played her song at their wedding. My father told me the best way to honor my mother's memory was to move forward. He said it at her funeral, his hand a heavy, unconvincing weight on my shoulder. He said it a year later when he introduced me to Meredith, his voice bright with a hope that felt like a betrayal, and he said it again, just last month, when he announced their engagement. "Your mother would want me to be happy, Chloe," he'd insisted, his eyes pleading for an absolution I couldn't give. I had simply nodded, my silence a cavern he was too eager to fill with his own justifications. But moving forward, I was learning. Looked a lot like erasure. It looked like my mother's clothes quietly disappearing from the closets, her favorite books being boxed up for charity, the scent of her perfume finally fading from the air. The final unforgivable act of erasure came in the form of a missing piano. It was a 1928 Steinway Baby Grand, its ivory keys worn smooth by my mother's fingers. It was the heart of our home, the place she'd taught me my first scales, the instrument on which she'd composed the lullaby she only ever played for me. My father claimed it was in a climate-controlled storage unit, a logistical necessity for their new, minimalist life in the condo they'd bought together. I didn't believe him. A cold knot of dread had been tightening in my stomach for months, and now it was a solid, unmovable stone. So I started digging. It wasn't hard. My father, for all his attempts at a new life, was careless. A single call to the storage company confirmed my fears. There was no unit in his name. A few more calls, a few white lies to sympathetic pawn shop owners about a stolen family heirloom, and I found it. There it was, sitting under a fluorescent light in a shop downtown, a price tag taped to its polished wood. The owner showed me the sales receipt, my father's signature, clear as day. The amount was pathetic, a fraction of its worth, $4,000. The date on the receipt was 2 days before Meredith had posted a photo of herself on social media, her forehead unnaturally smooth, her smile tight and waxy, thanking my father for the early wedding gift. The caption was accompanied by a hashtag, #Botox Bride. The wedding was an obscene display of beige and champagne, a monument to my father's desperate sprint away from his past. Meredith, clad in a dress that cost more than my car, drifted through the reception like a conquering queen, her face a serene, unmoving mask. My father orbited her, his smile as tight as her skin. They had asked me to give a toast, a final, public performance of the supportive daughter role they had cast for me. I had agreed with one condition. I told them I wanted to do something special, a musical tribute. I would need a piano. Meredith had wrinkled her nose, a feat of muscular rebellion against the toxins in her forehead. A piano? Chloe, darling, that's a bit old-fashioned. We have a DJ, I insisted. I told them it was the only way I could properly honor them. My father, relieved by my apparent compliance, had eagerly agreed. "Of course, sweetheart, whatever you want." He had no idea. He had no idea that for the past 2 weeks, I had been orchestrating my own symphony of revenge. I'd used the money my mother had left me, the only part of her estate my father hadn't yet been able to touch, to buy the piano back from the pawn shop. I'd hired movers to deliver it to the wedding venue, instructing them to keep it hidden until the reception. I had also hired a second videographer, a discreet professional whose only job was to keep a camera trained on me, my father, and Meredith for the entire evening. And I had brought a guest, my Uncle David, my mother's brother, a man who had been a quiet but constant presence in my life, a man who also happened to be a partner at one of the city's most formidable law firms. When the time came, the wedding planner tapped the microphone, and now, a special surprise from the groom's daughter, Chloe. A ripple of polite applause went through the room. My father and Meredith stood by the head table, champagne flutes in hand, their faces beaming with smug satisfaction. They thought this was their victory lap. The moment the prodigal daughter finally bent the knee, then the curtains at the side of the ballroom parted, and 2 stagehands rolled the Steinway into the center of the dance floor. A gasp went through the crowd. I saw my father's smile falter. His eyes widened, a flicker of confusion, then dawning horror. Meredith's face, however, remained placid, a perfect porcelain blank. She didn't recognize it. Of course she didn't. To her, it was just a piece of furniture. I walked to the piano and sat down, my fingers finding their familiar place on the cool ivory. The room fell silent. I looked directly at my father. His face was pale, his knuckles white where he gripped his champagne flute. I took a deep breath, and then I began to play. It was Chloe's song, the lullaby my mother had written for me. A simple, haunting melody that held all the love and tenderness of my childhood. I played it with a precision born of grief and rage. Every note was a memory. Every chord was a tear I had refused to shed. The music filled the room, a ghost at the feast, a beautiful, heartbreaking reminder of the woman they had worked so hard to erase. When the final note faded, a profound silence hung in the air. A few of the older guests, my mother's friends, were openly weeping. I stood up and walked to the microphone. My hands were steady. My voice, when I spoke, was clear and cold. "That was Chloe's song," I began, my gaze locked on my father. "My mother, Sarah, wrote it for me on this very piano." I let the words hang in the air. "This is a 1928 Steinway. It was her most prized possession, and after she died, it became mine." I paused, turning my head slightly to look at Meredith, who was now staring at me with a dawning, venomous understanding. "So you can imagine my surprise," I continued, my voice dropping an octave, "when I discovered that my father had sold it to a pawn shop for $4,000. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. My father looked like he had been struck by lightning. He started to say something, a sputtering denial smile, but I held up a hand, and he fell silent. I was curious, I went on. What could possibly be so urgent, so important, that he would sell the last, most precious piece of my mother I had left? So I did a little digging. I reached into the small clutch I was carrying and pulled out 2 pieces of paper. I held them up for everyone to see. This, I said, holding up the first one, is a copy of the pawn shop receipt, signed by my father, Robert Miller. Then I held up the second. And this is a copy of a receipt from a cosmetic clinic for $4,000 worth of Botox and fillers for a Miss Meredith Vance. The room erupted. It was no longer a wedding reception. It was a crime scene. Meredith let out a shriek, a sound of pure, undiluted fury that momentarily cracked her placid facade. "You little bitch!" she screamed, her voice raw. My father, galvanized into action, rushed towards me, his face a mask of purple rage. "How dare you? How dare you ruin this day?" But before he could reach me, a calm, solid presence was at my side. Uncle David. He put a protective arm around my shoulders and faced my father. "That's enough, Robert," he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable authority. "It's over." My father faltered, his blustering anger deflating in the face of my uncle's quiet steel. "What are you talking about, David? This is a family matter. She's hysterical." "No," my uncle said, his eyes hard. "This is a legal matter." On cue, a man in a nondescript suit who had been standing near the back of the room stepped forward. He moved with a swift professional grace, intercepting my father and Meredith as they stood frozen in the center of the room. "Robert Miller? Meredith Vance?" he asked, his tone flat. They both nodded dumbly. "You've been served." He handed each of them a thick manila envelope. The videographer I'd hired was right there, capturing the entire exchange in high definition. The shock on their faces, the legal documents in their hands, the crumbling of their perfectly curated world. The wedding guests were a sea of horrified and fascinated faces. Some were pulling out their phones, others were whispering frantically. The DJ had, in a moment of sheer panic, put on a generic pop song that now served as a surreal, upbeat soundtrack to my father's complete and utter implosion. I watched him tear open the envelope, his hands trembling. His eyes scanned the first page, and all the color drained from his face. He looked up at me, his expression a sickening cocktail of disbelief, hatred, and a dawning, terrifying understanding of what I had just done. He had underestimated me. They both had. They thought I was just a grieving daughter, a sad, passive obstacle to be managed. They never imagined I would be the architect of their downfall. The immediate aftermath was a blur of chaos and adrenaline. Meredith was screaming, not words, just a high-pitched, continuous wail of fury. My father was trying to grab the papers out of her hand, hissing at her to shut up, his face a mottled red. Uncle David steered me through the gawking crowd and out a side door into the cool night air. My legs felt like jelly. Now that the performance was over, a deep, bone-rattling tremor had taken hold of my body. I leaned against the brick wall of the venue, sucking in deep gulps of air. "You did it, Chloe," David said, his hand on my shoulder. "You were magnificent." "I think I'm going to be sick," I whispered, the rage that had fueled me for weeks suddenly draining away, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. The pristine, white-hot fury had been replaced by the old, familiar grief, but this time it was sharper, uglier. It wasn't just grief for my mother anymore. It was grief for the father I thought I had, for the family that was now just a pile of smoldering wreckage. The documents the server had delivered were the opening salvo in a war I had just declared. It was a lawsuit filing, a petition for a full accounting of my mother's estate, and a request for an immediate injunction to freeze all of my father's assets. The piano was just the beginning, the sentimental hook. The real crime, as Uncle David and I had discovered over the past 2 weeks of frantic investigation, was far deeper and more insidious. My father, under Meredith's influence, hadn't just sold a piano. He had been systematically liquidating the assets my mother had carefully put aside for me. Stocks, bonds, even a small piece of property she had inherited from her parents. All of it was being converted into cash to fund their lavish new life. The lawsuit was a desperate, last-ditch effort to stop the bleeding. The days that followed the wedding were a strange combination of numb shock and frantic activity. My phone blew up with texts and calls from relatives. Some were horrified, offering support. Others, the ones who had always been in my father's pocket, were furious, accusing me of being cruel, vindictive, and mentally unstable. My father's sister, Aunt Carol, called to scream at me for humiliating the family. "Your father is a good man," she shrieked. "He lost his wife. He deserves to be happy. What is wrong with you?" I didn't try to explain. I just hung up. The lines had been drawn. The world had neatly divided itself into those who were with me and those who were against me. The against camp was, depressingly, much larger. Uncle David became my general. We set up a war room in his home office. He explained the long, arduous road ahead. "They're going to fight back, Chloe, and it's going to get ugly. Their first move will be to discredit you. They'll say you're emotionally volatile, that your grief is clouding your judgment. They'll try to paint this as a family squabble, a daughter throwing a tantrum because daddy got a new girlfriend." He was right. The first legal response from my father and Meredith's high-priced lawyer was a motion to dismiss, accompanied by a sworn affidavit from my father. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. In it, he described me as a troubled young woman, prone to dramatic outbursts and flights of fancy. He claimed my mother's death had unhinged me. He mentioned the anxiety I had struggled with in my teens, twisting my past vulnerability into a weapon against me now. He even suggested I needed psychiatric help. Reading it felt like being punched in the gut. This was my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, using my deepest wounds to to try and destroy my credibility. It was the first time I truly understood the depth of his betrayal. He wasn't just a weak man manipulated by a greedy woman. He was a willing participant. He was my enemy. The next step was to find a therapist. David recommended a woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, who specialized in trauma and complex grief. My first session with her was brutal. I sat on her comfortable couch and recounted the entire story, from my mother's death to the wedding, and the dam I had so carefully constructed inside me finally broke. I wept for an hour straight, ugly, heaving sobs that left me exhausted and raw. Anya didn't say much. She just listened, her presence a calm, steady anchor in my storm. When I was finished, she handed me a box of tissues and said, "Chloe, what you did at that wedding was not an act of instability. It was an act of survival. You were pushed into a corner, and you fought back with the only weapons you had." Her words were a lifeline. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt seen. I felt sane. She helped me understand the psychological warfare my father and Meredith were waging. "They need you to be the crazy one," she explained. "It's the only way they can justify their own behavior, to themselves and to the world. Your stability is a direct threat to their narrative." Therapy became my sanctuary, the one place where I could let down my guard and process the tidal wave of emotions that threatened to drown me. It was also where I learned to build the emotional armor I would need for the battle ahead. Anya taught me grounding techniques, ways to stay present and calm when my father's lawyers tried to provoke me during depositions. She taught me to see their attacks not as personal failings, but as calculated legal strategy. While I was working on my internal defenses, Uncle David and his team were building our external case. The first order of business was the evidence. My mother had been a meticulous record keeper. Her life was documented in neat file folders and labeled boxes. I spent weeks in the dusty attic of my childhood home, which my father hadn't yet managed to sell, sifting through a lifetime of memories. It was a painful, bittersweet task. I found old photographs, letters, and journals. And I found the documents, bank statements, investment portfolios, deeds, and the carefully drawn-up will and trust agreements. I laid it all out on the floor of David's office, and we began the painstaking process of piecing together the puzzle. We created a timeline. We cross-referenced my mother's original documents with the current state of the accounts, which we had obtained through a court-ordered subpoena. The picture that emerged was sickening. It was a slow, methodical bleed. Small withdrawals at first, then larger ones. Stocks sold off, one block at a time. The vacation cabin in the mountains, a place filled with my happiest childhood memories, had been sold 6 months ago. My father had told me it was becoming too expensive to maintain. The proceeds had vanished. The trust my mother had established for me, which I was supposed to gain access to on my 25th birthday, had been systematically drained. My father, as the trustee, had used his position to funnel the money into his own accounts, which he shared with Meredith. The piano was nothing. It was a symbolic act of cruelty, but the real crime was a cold, calculated campaign of financial destruction. We were no longer talking about a family dispute. This was felony-level fraud, embezzlement, forgery. David brought in a forensic accountant, a quiet man named Mr. Chen, who spoke in the precise, emotionless language of numbers. He traced every dollar, every transaction, creating a roadmap of their greed. The money from the sale of the cabin had paid for their engagement trip to Europe. The funds from my trust had paid for Meredith's new car. The dividends from my mother's stock portfolio were paying the rent on their luxury condo. The discovery process was a war of attrition. My father's lawyers did everything they could to obstruct us. They filed endless motions. They delayed turning over documents. They objected to every request. They were trying to bleed us dry, financially and emotionally, hoping I would give up. The lowest point came during my deposition. We were in a sterile conference room in a downtown law firm. I sat at one end of a long, polished table. Across from me was my father, Meredith, and their lead attorney, a slick, silver-haired man named Marcus Thorne. My father wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the table, his face a grim, stony mask. Meredith, however, stared at me with undisguised hatred. Thorne's strategy was simple: to provoke me, to make me seem emotional and unreliable. He started with my mother's death. "Miss Miller, you were very close to your mother, weren't you?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. Anya's voice was in my head. "Just the facts. Do not engage. You are a witness, not a participant. Her death must have been a terrible blow. Devastating, in fact." "Yes. Did you seek any professional help for your grief?" "I saw a grief counselor for a time. And you're in therapy now, aren't you?" "Yes. So it's fair to say that you have a history of emotional fragility?" David slammed his hand on the table. "Objection. That's argumentative and insulting." Thorne just smiled, a thin reptilian smirk. "Just trying to establish the witness's state of mind, counselor." He went on like this for hours. He twisted my love for my mother into an unhealthy obsession. He portrayed my grief as a mental illness. He brought up a period in college when I'd been treated for anxiety, reading from my therapist's notes, which they had managed to subpoena. He tried to make me ashamed of my own vulnerability. I felt my composure starting to crack. My hands were shaking under the table. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to tell him what a vile, disgusting excuse for a human being he was. Then I looked at my father. He was still staring at the table, letting this happen, letting this stranger dissect his daughter's pain for sport. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. The fear and the hurt receded, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I would not let them break me. I took a deep breath, picturing the grounding exercise Anya California had taught me. I imagined my feet rooted to the floor, a pillar of strength running up my spine. When I spoke again, my voice was devoid of emotion. "Mr. Thorne," I said, looking him directly in the eye, "my mental health is not on trial here. My father's fraud is. Shall we get back to that?" The smirk vanished from his face. The tide had turned. The deposition was my rock bottom, but it was also my turning point. The experience galvanized my resolve. They had shown me their worst, and I had survived. The fear that had been a constant companion began to recede, replaced by a grim determination. I stopped seeing this as a personal tragedy and started seeing it as a strategic campaign. I poured all my energy into the case. I worked alongside Mr. Chen, the forensic accountant, helping him decipher my mother's financial records. My intimate knowledge of her life proved invaluable. I could identify signatures, explain obscure payments, and provide context that the numbers alone couldn't. Together, we uncovered the smoking gun. My mother had owned a small collection of rare art prints. They weren't famous masterpieces, but they were valuable. My father had claimed they were destroyed in a basement flood a few years back. I had never quite believed him, but I had no proof. While going through my mother's old emails, I found correspondence with a specialty insurer. On a hunch, I asked David to subpoena the insurance company's records. There it was. My father had filed a claim for the destroyed prints and received a substantial payout. Then, a few weeks later, we found something else. A shipping manifest from a fine art auction house in another state. The manifest listed the exact same prints, consigned for sale by one Meredith Vance. They had faked the destruction, collected the insurance money, and then sold the prints for a second profit. It was insurance fraud on top of everything else. It was stupid, it was greedy, and it was criminal. When David saw the documents, he leaned back in his chair and let out a long, slow whistle. "They're not just thieves, Chloe," he said. "They're amateurs, and amateurs get caught." This was the evidentiary turning point we had been waiting for. It was concrete, irrefutable proof of a criminal conspiracy. This discovery shifted our entire strategy. What had started as a civil suit to recover stolen assets now had the potential to become a criminal case. David arranged a meeting with the district attorney's office. We walked into the meeting armed with a mountain of evidence: Mr. Chen's meticulously prepared financial reports, the insurance fraud documentation, and sworn affidavits from the pawn shop owner and the auction house. The assistant district attorney who heard our case was a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Evans. She listened patiently as David laid out the facts, her face unreadable. When he was finished, she turned to me. "Miss Miller," she said, her eyes studying me intently, "this is a serious accusation to make against your own father. Are you prepared to see this through? To testify against him in a criminal court?" I thought of my mother. I thought of her piano, her song, her memory being systematically dismantled and sold off to the highest bidder. I thought of my father, sitting silently in that deposition while a stranger tore me apart. "Yes," I said, my voice unwavering. "I am." The decision to pursue criminal charges was the hardest one I had to make. It meant crossing a final, irrevocable line. It meant sending my own father to prison. A part of me, a small, childish part that still remembered him reading me bedtime stories, recoiled from the idea. But the man who had done that was gone, replaced by a stranger who had stolen my inheritance and my past. Protecting that stranger's freedom was a betrayal of my mother's memory. I had to choose, and I chose her. The news that the DA's office was pressing charges sent a shockwave through the family. My father and Meredith, who had been treating the civil suit as a nuisance, were suddenly facing the very real possibility of jail time. Their arrogance evaporated, replaced by panic. My father started calling me, leaving long, rambling voicemails. At first, they were angry and threatening. Then, they became pleading. "Chloe, please," he begged in one message, his voice thick with a self-pity that turned my stomach. "You can't do this. I'm your father. We can work this out. Just call off the lawyers. We can talk, just the two of us." He offered me money. A generous settlement, he called it. He promised to pay back everything with interest if I would just make this all go away. He was trying to bribe me into silence. He still didn't get it. He thought this was about the money. He couldn't comprehend that some things weren't for sale. I never returned his calls. The legal system moves at a glacial pace. Months bled into a year, then another. The time was filled with pretrial motions, hearings, and endless legal wrangling. My father and Meredith's defense strategy was to delay, hoping to wear me down. It was a lonely, isolating period. Many of my mother's friends, who had been supportive at first, began to drift away, uncomfortable with the ugliness of it all. They wanted me to move on, to find peace. They didn't understand that for me, peace could only be found on the other side of justice. My support system shrank to a small, tight-knit group. Uncle David, Anya, and a few loyal friends who brought me groceries and forced me to go for walks when I couldn't summon the energy to leave my apartment. The piano became my sanctuary. In the evenings, when the weight of it all felt too heavy to bear, I would sit and play. I played my mother's songs. I played the classical pieces she had loved, and I began to compose my own music. The melodies were tentative at first, filled with sorrow and anger, but slowly, over time, a new note began to creep in, a note of resilience, of hope. The civil case was settled out of court. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of the criminal investigation, my father's lawyers advised them to cut their losses. They agreed to a judgment that returned a significant portion of the stolen assets. It wasn't everything. Much of the money had been spent, vanished into the ether of Meredith's shopping sprees and my father's bad investments, but it was enough. It was a victory. The day the settlement check cleared, I didn't feel the elation elation I had expected. I just felt a quiet, weary relief. The money allowed me to quit my job and focus entirely on the upcoming criminal trial. It also gave me the resources to do something I had been dreaming of. I established the Sarah Miller Music Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing musical instruments and education to underprivileged children. It was a way to turn the ugliness of my father's greed into something beautiful, a way to make my mother's legacy a living, breathing thing in the world. The day the trial began, I walked into the courthouse feeling a strange sense of calm. 2 years of preparation had led to this moment. I knew the facts inside and out. I had rehearsed my testimony with David's team until the words were second nature. I was ready. Seeing my father and Meredith sitting at the defendant's table was jarring. They looked smaller, diminished under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The expensive clothes and confident swagger were gone. My father had aged a decade. His hair was grayer, his face etched with worry. Meredith looked pale and drawn, her Botox long since faded, revealing the worried lines of a woman facing the consequences of her actions for the first time in her life. The trial unfolded over 2 weeks. Ms. Evans, the prosecutor, was brilliant. She methodically built her case brick by brick. She called the pawn shop owner, the auctioneer, the insurance adjuster, and Mr. Chen, who walked the jury through the labyrinthine financial records with damning clarity. The linchpin of the prosecution's case, however, was me. My turn on the witness stand was the moment I had been both dreading and preparing for. Marcus Thorne, their lawyer, had been replaced by a court-appointed public defender who lacked Thorne's venom but was still tasked with the unenviable job of dismantling my credibility. He tried to portray me as a vindictive daughter, motivated by jealousy and resentment of her father's new wife. He brought up the scene at the wedding, painting it as a premeditated act of public humiliation rather than a desperate plea for truth. "Miss Miller," he asked, his tone dripping with faux sympathy, "isn't it true that you never liked Meredith, that you felt she was trying to replace your mother?" "My mother is irreplaceable," I answered, my voice even. "And this case is not about my feelings. It's about forged documents and stolen money." He tried to trip me up on dates and figures, but I was prepared. I answered every question calmly and precisely, sticking to the facts. I looked at the jury, making eye contact, willing them to see the truth. I spoke about my mother, about her piano, and what it represented. I told them about the trust she had set up to secure my future, and the cold, methodical way it had been plundered. During my testimony, I never once looked at my father. I couldn't. I focused on a spot on the back wall, channeling Anya's voice, her lessons on grounding and emotional regulation. I was a rock. I was a pillar. I would not let them see me break. The cross-examination was grueling, but I held my own. The most difficult part was when my father's lawyer presented a series of loving emails and birthday cards he had sent me over the years. "Miss Miller, these don't seem like the words of a man who hates his daughter, do they?" I looked at the emails, at the familiar handwriting on the cards. A wave of grief washed over me for the man he used to be, or the man I thought he was. "No," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't suppress. "They seem like the words of a man who was very good at lying." After I stepped down from the stand, I couldn't stay in the courtroom. I sat on a bench in the hallway, my body trembling with the release of 2 years of pent-up tension. David sat with me, his hand on my back, not saying a word. We didn't have to wait long. The jury was out for less than 4 hours. When we were called back into the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. I held my breath as the foreman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood to read the verdict. "On the charge of grand larceny, we the jury find the defendant, Robert Miller, guilty." A sob escaped my lips, a sound of shock and relief. "On the charge of forgery, we find the defendant, Robert Miller, guilty." On and on it went, a litany of their crimes, each one followed by the same beautiful word, guilty. Meredith was found guilty on all counts as well. I finally looked at my father. He was staring at the floor, his face slack with defeat. Meredith was weeping silently, her hands covering her face. There was no triumph in that moment, no joy, just a profound, hollow sadness. I had won, but what had I lost in the process? The sentencing was 2 weeks later. Ms. Evans argued for a significant prison sentence, citing the calculated, long-term nature of the fraud and the profound breach of trust. My father and Meredith's lawyer pleaded for leniency, painting them as first-time offenders who had made a terrible mistake. They had letters of support from Aunt Carol and other family members, describing my father as a loving, devoted man, devastated by grief. My father was given the opportunity to speak. He stood up, his hands shaking, and turned to face me for the first time in the entire trial. "Chloe," he began, his voice cracking, "I am so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I loved your mother, and I love you. I got lost. Meredith, we just wanted a fresh start. I know that's no excuse. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it up to you if you'll let me." It was a good performance. He sounded sincere. He looked broken, but I knew him. I saw the calculation in his eyes. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was sorry he got caught. The judge listened impassively. He spoke about the sanctity of trust, especially between a parent and a child. He spoke about the difference between a mistake and a deliberate, sustained campaign of deception. "The damage here is not just financial," he said, looking at my father. "You have destroyed your daughter's ability to trust. You have desecrated the memory of your late wife, and you have torn your family apart. That is a crime for which no prison sentence is adequate." My heart leaped. He understood. "However," the judge continued, "in light of your age, your lack of a prior record, and your apparent remorse," my heart sank. I knew what was coming. He sentenced my father to 5 years of probation, 1,000 hours of community service, and full financial restitution. Meredith received a similar sentence. No jail time. They walked out of the courtroom free men and women, while I felt like I was the one who had been given a life sentence. That was the bittersweet verdict. Justice, but not justice. Vindication, but not satisfaction. They had been held accountable in a court of law, their guilt a matter of public record, but the punishment felt woefully inadequate for the scale of the devastation they had caused. In my next session with Anya, I raged. "It's not fair," I yelled, pacing her office. "They get to go on with their lives, while I'm left to pick up the pieces of mine. They stole my past and my future, and they get a slap on the wrist." Anya let me vent, let me scream and cry until I was exhausted. "You're right, Chloe," she said quietly, when I had finally collapsed back onto the couch. "It's not fair. The legal system is designed to punish actions, not to heal wounds. The justice you received in that courtroom was always going to be incomplete. The real justice, the real healing, has to come from you." It took me a long time to understand what she meant. For months, I was consumed by a bitter, resentful anger. I followed the news of their lives through the family grapevine. They had to sell the condo. They declared bankruptcy. Meredith left him. My father was living in a small rented apartment, working a menial job to make his restitution payments. The news brought me a grim, fleeting satisfaction, but it didn't fill the hole inside me. The healing began when I finally accepted the incompleteness of it all. I would never get a genuine apology from my father. I would never get back the years I lost to grief and legal battles. I would never have the father I deserved. Accepting that was a kind of liberation. It meant I could finally stop waiting for something that was never going to come. I could stop letting him occupy space in my head and my heart. I started the long, slow process of rebuilding. I threw myself into the Sarah Miller Music Foundation. We partnered with schools, set up after-school programs, and held instrument drives. Seeing the joy on a child's face when they held a violin for the first time, or the pride in their eyes after their first recital, that was real. That was tangible. It was a legacy my mother would have been proud of. I reconnected with the friends who had stood by me, and I let go of the family members who hadn't. I established firm, non-negotiable boundaries. I changed my phone number and blocked the emails of anyone who tried to argue for forgiveness or reconciliation. My life became smaller, quieter, but infinitely more peaceful. Uncle David remained my rock, stepping into the paternal role my own father had so spectacularly abdicated. We had dinner every Sunday, a new tradition to replace the old, broken ones. He never pushed me to talk about the trial, but he was always there to listen when I needed to. One day, about a year after the sentencing, a letter arrived. It was from my father. My first instinct was to burn it, unopened. But curiosity, a faint, lingering echo of the daughter I used to be, got the better of me. I opened it. It was 12 pages long, front and back, written in his familiar, sloping hand. It was a long, rambling screed of self-pity and blame. He blamed Meredith. He blamed his grief. He blamed the lawyers. He even blamed my mother for dying. He never once took full responsibility for his own actions. Tucked into the last page was a single, chilling sentence. "I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me, because at the end of the day, I'm still your father, and you're still my daughter." I read the letter, and I felt nothing. The rage was gone. The hurt was a dull, distant ache. All I felt was a profound sense of pity for this small, sad man who had destroyed everything good in his life, and still didn't understand why. I took the letter, walked to the fireplace, and watched it turn to ash. That was the day I truly became free. My life now is quiet, and it is my own. I have a small apartment in a new city, filled with books and music. My mother's piano sits in the living room, its wood gleaming in the afternoon sun. I play it every day. Not the sad songs anymore, but new ones. Pieces filled with complex chords of sorrow and resilience, melodies that speak of loss, but also of survival. I am still in therapy. Anya says trauma isn't something you get over, it's something you learn to carry. Mine is a part of my story, but it is not the whole story. It does not define me. Sometimes I think about justice. I used to believe it was a destination, a final verdict that would make everything right. I know now that it's a process. It's the painstaking work of gathering evidence, the terror of facing your abuser in court, the quiet daily act of choosing to heal. It's building new boundaries and a new life on the ashes of the old one. It's creating a foundation in your mother's name, so her memory becomes a source of music and not just a source of pain. The scars are still there. They always will be, but they are no longer open wounds. They are a part of my tapestry, a reminder of the battle I fought and the strength I found in the wreckage. The story doesn't end with a triumphant crescendo. It ends with a quiet chord, a moment of peace. It ends with me, sitting at my mother's piano, not playing her song, but composing my own. A song of a new beginning, written in a key I have chosen for myself. Well, you made it. If you sat through that entire emotional roller coaster, you deserve a medal, or at least a very comfortable chair. I bet you thought it was going to be a quick little story about a piano, and here we are, 10,000 words and several felonies later. You're a real trooper. Seriously though, thanks for sticking with it to the end. If you're not too emotionally drained to move your mouse, maybe consider hitting that subscribe button. It would be a lot less dramatic than anything I just talked about, I promise.